the raise hand features and stuff for Q&A, so we can unmute and mute folks, or you can unmute yourself, or we can, all those kind of things. So welcome to the Microsoft Teams and 365 Power User Group. Today is part one of a category that we call identity and access. And it's not just what we call, but identity and access management. We're saying this is part one because we're going to cover some of the foundational core components relative to applying things like multi-factor authentication and some of the different settings, nuances, capabilities, options, et cetera, relative to multi-factor authentication. So my name is Nathan Austin. I'm going to be guiding from a facilitation perspective and maybe interjecting some questions. And we have Corey, though, is going to be our primary presenter, an engineer who is part of designing these solutions for our clients, as well as implementing these solutions for our clients. And he's going to walk us through the session today. So we have, roughly 45 minutes to an hour of content, and then we open up for Q&A. But because of the nature of this, I also am game for if there's some questions in the meantime, please poke them into the to the chat. Love to have you throw some questions into the chat. And then if I can either interject them with questions with Corey, I will. Or we'll just open them up at the end, depending on kind of the nature of the question and if it makes sense to kind of throw it into the middle there. So this session is also being recorded and will be posted on our Power User Group page once we're done for posterity, if you will, or for future reference. So move along, Corey, to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. We again, thank you, everyone. We ask you to mute your mic. Again, using the chat conversation, and as we get to the end, raise hand feature, we'll use that to work through it. So some of the housekeeping items. Next, Corey. And then, so one of the things before we get going, I also like to say 1 minute about MyTech. We love hosting these because we've learned a lot of organizations are trying to use Microsoft 365 better. But we're not a training organization, but we are a business and technology consulting organization that works with small and medium businesses. Over the last 20 years, we've developed what we call a proven IT strategy that we know delivers consistent, reliable results for our clients. It is not the only IT strategy, but is one that we build our entire business around. And so what we found, if there's some good alignment and engagement with our clients, and we can both philosophically agree to that methodology, then we can remove IT challenges for you and help you focus on help you serve your clients better and be more adaptable to the other business challenges that we all inevitably face in this world. When we do that, the journey that we shoot for and that we can achieve together is that our clients achieve 4 times more value and productivity from their IT investments. That's not why you're here today, but I always like to at least throw 1 minute about MyTech, so you know a little bit about who we are. And but with this said, Corey, I think I'll hand it over to you and take away the session so you can share about identity and access management, part 1.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nate. So we'll start here by just kind of redefining what a power user is. And that's, somebody who within an organization is going to help drive adoption of new technologies, right? Somebody who's a little more technical savvy, somebody who understands the technology. A lot of those are you here in this session as well. Somebody who's going to help understand the pros and the cons of actions that are taken. Everybody can do some good old Googling and find answers to things, but it's not always 100% accurate, or maybe it's not the best way to do it or the most secure way to do it. So, those are the people in the power group, understanding the needs of the organizations too, right? So obviously we don't know every single organization's needs out there, but you understand your organization's needs and what's required. And so that helps, bring you into that group of people who will help drive technology within the organization. And then kind of that last point there with, working with, CTOs, CIOs, individuals like that, helping them see the light of change within the organization and what that can do for an organization. And some of you may be in those positions here as well. And so we'll move into a quick recap of some of the last sessions we've had. We've been working through, sharing, like, how do you share and store files within SharePoint? How do you access those from Teams? How can you use Teams to collaborate between different, departments, users, different elements like that really bring together a more seamless platform to communicate with everybody within your organization. We even went through how to, involve guests in that collaboration, right? Can you invite a guest in and let them access and review documents and provide feedback and comments as well? as that goes. And then also the last two sessions were about labeling and protecting that data, right? So if you're sharing and communicating that data even within the organization or with outside of the organization, how can you make sure that data stays secure? And, giving the permissions or assigning tags, whatever that happens to be, that provides rules around that data, right? So you might put a rule that would say, this is internal only, no emailing, things like that. And that would be some of those label protections that can be applied. Some of those can also go into, depending on how it's set up, into some additional protection for the company, insurance requirements, things like that. So
And that just
moving on.
one of the things is that last section that again, we call this header identity and access management, but most people think of multi-factor authentication or user access. Those last sessions that Corey just described of labeling and protecting, that falls under the category of data loss prevention, is maybe some phrases you've heard out there relative to, again, everything Corey just said is it kind of falls under that header, but that's oftentimes if you search out there for things like, or if you heard data loss prevention, that's what Corey was talking about relative to the last couple sessions that we hosted.
Thanks, Nate. So the next sections here of the identity and access management, we are going to split into two sessions. Today's session is going to be focused more around the multi-factor authentication itself within the Microsoft platform, right? Talking about some local admin things that can be done, talking about conditional access rules, how you can do different things to allow users on site or remote to have different access permissions. And then just a general quick talk on the application, Microsoft applications, and how that does a little bit of single sign-on, which makes transition between applications more smooth. And then looking at other password options, such as using hardware tokens or biometrics to authenticate instead of having to try to remember 500,000 passwords to log into everything. Next time, we're going to talk about single sign-on, which is something that's really nice as an extension with the Microsoft 365 platform, and especially the MFA, because then what can happen is now you can have one user account, your username, your password for your Microsoft 365 platform, and you can take that with you and use it to log into, maybe your CRM solution or your EHR solution or something along those lines. It will also still apply all those conditional access rules that are in the Microsoft 365 platform to add that layer of multi-factor authentication to those applications. And there are many applications that have single sign-on capability, but don't have MFA capability. And this is a way to work around that to help protect that data even more. All right, and so that is going to be the next session. Big thing we like to call out too is that Microsoft has a huge amount of licensing, right? And every time it seems like there's a little change or a little tweak to it. Most of the licensing features that we're going to talk about today are going to fall under the Business Premium. That's a nice license set, which gets you a very secure platform. Doesn't cost an arm and a leg compared to some of the other ones, but it's it's kind of that 80-90% feature set of the 365 platform. The tenant that we're going to use for some of our demo work later is a fully licensed, full feature tenant. So you may see some features in there that you don't have access to in your tenant, but licensing can usually resolve that. It's where you can reach out to us to help determine what licensing you may need for those solutions. And so the Business Premium here is just right in this column. It's highlighted. And then several of the Microsoft 365 SKUs, don't get those confused with the Office 365 SKUs. The Microsoft 365 SKUs, a lot of those also have these feature sets in there as well. So big talk of MFA. So what exactly is MFA? Basically, it comes down to three things. It's something you have, something you know, and something you are. So something you have would be a hardware token. Like you can see on the screen here, there is this hardware token. This is a YubiKey, something that you physically have that you can plug into a device. It might even be a badge card reader, something that, kind of proves something about you that's not something you know. Something you know is typically what everybody thinks of, username and password. Both of those classify under the something you know category. Even something can be questions that you might see for password reset, like, what was the name of your first dog? What street did you grow up on? Those are all part of the something you know category. Something you are, that would be your biometrics, right? That's your fingerprint. That might be the Face ID. A lot of us are common seeing this with phones, right? You use your thumb to log into your phone or your face to log into your phone, that's something you are. And a lot of the something you have work off of the one-time passcode mentality or the time-based one-time passcode. So the big difference here is that the one-time passcode is usually going to fall under like a SMS or a text message or an email that you'll receive with that 6-digit code you have to retrieve and type it in. You know, that works the one time. After that, it's no good. Every time, next time you log in, you're going to get a new text or a new email. Depending on those solutions, a lot of those are starting to become less and less secure, which is where they came out with the time-based one-time passcode. And so this is where you have basically a hash with that's comprised of time and like a password in the background. You don't set it, the system sets it. And it basically creates a hash, and that hash then is timed with connected with an application like the Microsoft Authenticator app, which is what we recommend for anything dealing with MFA with Microsoft. There's some other feature sets that come into play with that, which we're not going to talk about in this session, but just be aware of that. And that, you know, it allows for that continual rotation of that pass phrase, and it prompts to like your physical device, right? I can't necessarily take that, you know, code out of that device, go to another device and load it into that device, right? And it's constantly revolving. It runs on a 30-second cycle. And so it's constantly refreshing. And some of those also other methods that you might see, especially with the Microsoft Authenticator app, is like a push notification. So instead of having to actually go look up that code, it'll actually just send an alert right to your phone. Hey, do you want to log in? Yes or no. And then you can move from there.
Yeah, Corey, that last one I think is interesting. That is a little bit of a gotcha that we've communicated with our team about those push notifications. Is that, you know, if you didn't try and log into something and you got a push notification, don't approve it, right?
Yep.
Because that's maybe someone trying to hack into your account that they guessed your password right. And if you click approve, you might be letting them in. So that's a little gotcha about the push notifications that create a little bit extra risk that you might consider as far as how you might implement that in your organization.
Yeah. And when we get into the demo, I'm also going to kind of show an area where you can set rules around that. So if, you know, it's going to say, is this you, basically, yes or no, right? And there's some rules you can set where if somebody says no, it can do some different things like lock the account, block the account from signing in, some things like that. So we'll look at that in the demo as well, just so you can kind of see that we have some of those settings as well. But to help mitigate some of those risks that might come from that. All right, so why MFA? I think everybody kind of understands that, but it helps protect accounts from stolen passwords, right? It's not a matter of if your password is going to get stolen, it's a matter of when, right? And so there's a lot of websites out there you can Google, you know, has my password been stolen? And they have these huge databases of passwords. You can put in a password and it'll tell you if it's been reported as part of a breach. Chances are there's about a 75% chance of your password showing up if it's, you know, out there somewhere for a while. You know, and so MFA helps kind of protect against the stolen passwords. It doesn't prevent the password from getting stolen, but it allows you to have a second layer of authentication that if somebody were to steal it, as we were noting with a push notification, right? It's, oh, hey, somebody's trying to log in. They stole my password. If it wasn't me, I can hit, you know, decline that login and go change my password. You know, it helps protect against weak passwords, which are often the ones that are stolen. I always find every year I get this email, you know, it's like, oh, here are the top, you know, 20 passwords that are, you know, used or breached. And it's, you know, things like password 123 or exclamation point password 1, or, you know, simple passwords like that. You know, MFA helps provide a layer of protection against those weaker passwords. Oftentimes people will even use the same password for, you know, almost everything they log into. Helps, you know, prevent some account access with the MFA enabled. So, and it, you know, it adds that layer of protection for accessing organizational data, which is starting to become more and more of a requirement, especially for cyber insurance. We're starting to see, especially over the last 6 months, a large influx of requests for assisting with MFA setup due to cyber insurance. It's getting to the point where insurance companies won't even talk to you unless you have MFA enabled. And it's not just MFA on accessing email. It's usually a clause that says, multi-factor authentication applied to, it might say email and any other cloud-based solutions. And so they throw that gotcha in there. And that's where, like, next session is going to be talking about single sign-on. How can you implement, the MFA across multiple solutions and use one source of identity? But insurance is really starting to drive a big adoption of multi-factor authentication, just because it is that extra layer of protection that makes things way more secure. It doesn't prevent a breach, but it greatly reduces the risk of a breach from stolen passwords. And if you think, what was it, a year or so ago, there was the big oil company on the East Coast that had a breach, stolen password, and that's how they got in, and they were able to take down a huge organization from a stolen password. If multi-factor authentication had been enabled on their VPN solution, it wouldn't have had that happen. So even with the stolen password.
Yeah, just to be clear, we actually did another session where we actually brought in an insurance expert who he was a technical person that worked for an insurance company where he was involved in helping companies with this, as well as handling any type of when a breach happens or an incident happens. But yeah, basically what we have found across lots of pretty much all of our clients and all the different insurance companies that are out there at the moment, they are all, it's not a nice to have anymore. Like if you want to renew, so this is one of the gotchas. We're trying to just be evangelizers of this because I don't want any of you to get caught off guard. If your business is either thinking about getting cyber insurance or trying to renew an existing policy, neither of them will be able to happen unless you have MFA enabled. In fact, we're being told that when we participated in these phone calls with in insurance companies and our clients, they're saying that they again don't even submit the application unless you can check the box that MFA is turned on or that you have it turned on. So they're really cracking down on that. And and again, if you haven't turned on MFA for your organization yet, and if you're not sure about this, especially if you're not one of the executives that's responsible for that, I would bring this to their attention, because if your renewal is next month, I don't want you to get caught off guard that you need to turn this on in the next 30 days. That would be my asterisk public service announcement relative to that. So thanks for bringing that up, Corey, because it's super important.
Definitely. Yeah. Thanks, Nate. Yeah. And so MFA, protect your company, right? So some things to consider, especially around MFA, right? So when you have different methods, as we've kind of talked about, right? You can get a text message, or you can get an email, or you have the Authenticator app. You really have to determine what methods as an organization do you want to approve. As I had mentioned earlier, text or SMS, not super secure anymore, right? I think it was a year and a half, maybe a year ago now, one of the major cell providers had their user database breached. That user database included all the SIM card numbers and everything from phones, which then allows somebody to use a simple, application in a computer, and they can replicate your phone, and all of a sudden they can get all your text messages, and they get all your text messages. Then all of a sudden now they have your MFA code that were sent, and they can get into your account. We're also seeing some of that with email in a sense. So, they might get in, they might put a forward rule on the email that you have no idea is there, and all of a sudden all their emails are being forwarded to, somebody. Now they have that passcodes. So anytime that a passcode is, sent out through a source like that, it can often, not necessarily be secure. So those are things you want to consider with approved methods, right? So our recommendation as an organization is to use, like I said earlier, the Microsoft Authenticator app, or hardware tokens, or something along those lines. Another app maybe that does that TOTP based coding. Google has their Google Authenticator, things like that out there, but we really push for the Microsoft one with the platform because of the seamless experience that it provides. And so also licensing, so requires a minimum of Azure AD Premium 1 licensing. That comes with the Business Premium license that we mentioned earlier, but it can be an add-on for any other license SKU that doesn't include it. So you might have accounts that are just email-only users who don't need the full feature set of, Office and SharePoint and all those. So you might just have an email-only user who has an Exchange-only license. You can add this to that Exchange-only license, and then they can be set up with MFA. And then along with that is what accounts should be MFA. So there's always those accounts out there that are not necessarily a regular user account, right? And so those are going to be service accounts. Might be a great example that we have is scanner accounts for scan to email to allow that functionality for scanning from a on-premises scanner to send it out through your 365 email. Those need some form of authentication. Well, the printer can't MFA itself to 365, which would be cool if it could, but that's an option where you might have to think about how do you protect that account without MFA from somebody being able to breach it, right? And so we'll kind of show a cool little demo here, or the demo where you can do something like that to help protect that account. And then you might also have guest users who have access into your environment, right? Might be just to do some collaboration, might be in a use case that my tech in the past did is we collaborated with another organization to put on an event. Can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Nate, you could probably help me there. Tech Pulse, that was it, right? Tech Pulse. Yep. And so we used guest user account access and things like that to share files back and forth and to collaborate through Teams. You can enable MFA for guest users. Nice thing is, guest users do not require a license to enable MFA in your tenant. And so that can be a big caveat. People are like, oh, I have to get licensing for all these. Not for guest users. We see guest users used a lot, as we talked about in the guest user session, with board members and groups like that, where they can bring their own email address in and access company data. So those are great users to look at, still providing MFA to without needing to add a license. And then obviously, all admin accounts should be MFA'd, with the exception, as I'm going to call out here, is the break glass account. So Microsoft's recommendation and our recommendation is to create a break glass account. And what this is an account that you can get into your 365 tenant that uses like something crazy, like a 64 character password, right? Something that nobody in their right mind is going to be out there trying to type in because it's just so ridiculously long. And what this account does is it allows you access in if things were to break. So, Microsoft's not perfect, but sometimes there's services that go down. And if that service that does MFA goes down, nobody can authenticate. How do you get in? You have a break glass account that allows, one person in. Not everybody has access to this account. It might just be like a CTO type individual who has access to this account. They can go in, they can turn off MFA for a short time frame just to let everybody work. Things like that, but that's what the break glass account's for. So considerations on who should have access, what does a break glass account look like, and even with that you can still do some protections around that account, but that account's one that will get you into the environment if things break. The other one is organizational data access requirements, right? So there might be some requirements that certain data can be accessed from one location and not another. And so if they're accessing it from one location coming in, let's say an office in China, right? Because China has a lot of data sovereignty laws. You might be able to, you can put a rule in that would say, oh, anybody coming from China trying to access data here, deny. Don't allow access. Or you can put additional recommendations in there on, need to have, another layer of authentication, or they require MFA, or they have to be connecting from an approved device, things like that, which we'll talk about the different conditions and elements here in just a little bit. As we mentioned earlier, insurance requirements may have some special considerations for MFA enablement, and then fraud alerts. And this is where we were talking about earlier, where you have, somebody who gets that prompt like, hey, is this you trying to log into this account? And if it's not, fraud alerts is where you can set up those rules to say, oh, block that user from signing in, different elements like that. So those are all things to consider as you're designing out your solution for MFA. And one other thing here with MFA that we just like to throw out there. So local admin MFA is one that we have seen coming up recently, where that's your admin. If he goes to a just a regular workstation, how does that admin authenticate to that PC with a direct login to prevent that PC from being able to creep through the network and start making changes, right? And so it's really designed to protect the internal network from inside the network. So Microsoft has a solution called LAPS, or it's Microsoft Local Admin Password Solution. What this does is it creates a local admin on each PC, and what it does is it rotates the password. So if you set it to every 24 hours, every 6 hours, every 12 hours, whatever your time frame is, it rotates that password. And so that allows you to have a rotating password that's not remembered. It's different on every machine. And then you set up so that domain admins can't actually log into a workstation. And this, most insurance companies will accept this as local admin authentication. Now this works in some situations, but not all, right? And so the other options, there's third-party tools. We have, worked with a couple out there. Auth-Lite is one where it actually just installs right in your local environment. It actually adds a nice little passcode box to the Windows login to put in a 3-digit code. Works across the environment, whether you're logging into a server, a workstation, anything that does a authentication call to the Active Directory server. So there's that one. There's also Duo, which is out there, which is a cloud-based solution. But just to note that there's those other optional solutions out there that may be needed to hit some of those local admin MFA requirements. So the meat behind Microsoft's MFA solution is conditional access. And conditional access is basically a whole bunch of rules that permit or deny how somebody can access the data that's stored within 365 or any call that's made towards Azure Active Directory for authentication. And so this could be, a rule saying if I'm logging in from within my office, I don't need MFA. If I'm logging in from outside of my office, I need MFA. Each of these rules, think of it as an and statement, right? It's not a if this statement applies, use it and skip the rest. It's apply statement 1, then apply statement 2, then apply statement 3. And so as we look at this, you might see multiple statements that are then getting applied to a particular user, and all of a sudden, statement 1's good, statement 2's good, statement 3 all of a sudden says, oh, well, this user has a risky sign-in, so I'm going to force that user to change their password and MFA again. Right. And so you might have these different rules that come in there, and the big call out is they're and statements, not or statements, right? So all of the rules applied, it will process through all the rules as you log in. There is a report only mode, which is fantastic for testing. So if you're, trying to figure out how is the conditional access rule going to work within your organization, turn it on to report only mode. That report only mode will then give you logging on how that's being applied. And then you can see, oh, hey, this is working here, it's not working here, or you might get a rule that says all of a sudden it's blocking everybody from signing in, and you're like, uh-oh, something's wrong with the rule. So highly recommend using the report only mode before you actually go full bore and turn it on, so that way you don't break access to everything. And then as you do your conditional access rules, big thing is you can specify each rule based on either a user, a group, or multiple users and multiple groups, or a role. So Microsoft 365 has a lot of roles, right? So you might have global admin role, or help desk administrator, or SharePoint administrator, all these different rules. You can set up rules specific to that particular role as well. And then you also have app selection. So apps are, typically when you think about it, anything that you install that you access, right? So Microsoft Word, that would be an app. Microsoft Excel, that would be an app. Any app like that has to be registered in Azure Active Directory. And so a common one that we've been setting up is using like Azure VPN. So Azure VPN, you register the app, and now you can apply conditional access rules to the Azure VPN. So a big call out is any application that's not native built in, which is basically non-Microsoft native apps, and even some of those aren't necessarily listed right away. They all have to be registered in Azure Active Directory to apply a conditional access rule to them. Our next session will go into a little bit more about app registration, because that plays a larger part into single sign-on than it does here, but just as a note, it has to be registered. So the conditions, what conditions are there? And so there's user risk and sign-in risk. Now, these sound almost identical, and they are almost identical, but they're slightly different. So user risk takes a look at historical sign-ins. So if a user is always signing in from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and then all of a sudden, randomly in the afternoon, signs in from Los Angeles, that's going to say, hey, something's a little off here. That might be a risk. Sign-in risk, it evaluates every individual sign-in, and it requires Azure Active Directory P2 licensing. And so this is going to give you more granular controls as to things like impossible travel. So if you log in from, like I said, Minneapolis, Minnesota at 1 p.m., and all of a sudden your account tries to log in from, South America somewhere, let's say like Chile at 1:10 p.m., it's going to be like, that's impossible for somebody to have traveled, 2,000 miles in the matter of 10 minutes. And that's what sign-in risk is going to look at, is more of that individual-based sign-in. You can apply conditions based on device platform, right? So you can do mobile devices, whether that's iOS, Android, Mac OS, Windows, the different device platforms out there. Locations is another one. So locations, you might think of, you got this office or that office. Think of it more as IP addresses, right? Every site has a public IP address. And so locations are basically putting in public IP addresses to your office that you can say, hey, if somebody's signing in from here, don't apply this rule and this rule, but apply this rule. Client apps is another feature set here. And so this comes more to modern authentication versus legacy authentication. And so think of modern authentication as using the newer, more secure protocols, where legacy authentication is using like POP3 and those kind of older protocols. For the most part, as long as you're using the newer Office app products, everything's using modern authentication. And a lot of our recommendation is actually to disable legacy authentication because it's less secure, right? It's easier for somebody to capture some of that traffic and potentially figure out a password or decrypt emails. So client apps is where you can say, disable legacy authentication to applications. And that may even include using some auth-based applications that aren't native for like email example, right? Outlook is like the native email application for Microsoft. It might be looking at using, Mozilla's Fire or the Thunderbird solution, right? Like potentially will block that because it's going to not necessarily use the same modern authentication as the Outlook app will. So client apps is what's there. The device state, this comes to devices that are joined to Azure Active Directory. And so you can put in rules within Intune, which is part of the Microsoft device management solution that can, say like, hey, this device doesn't have an antivirus, it's non-compliant, or this device does have antivirus, so it is compliant. Those device states can then be also applied to conditional access rules, so that if for some reason a device is, sitting out there not used, all of a sudden it's not up to date on Windows, patching, it's not up to date on antivirus, it's not got these different requirements met, it can't connect. And then the filter for device, this is a newer element that's, I remember correctly, it might still be in preview. But this is where you can create custom rules around access for a device. So you can actually like pull up a PowerShell command and pull all the different parameters for a device. And then you could specify like each individual parameter. We'll take a quick peek at it just so you can see what it kind of looks like, but we're not actually going to do any requirements in there, but it is something that's out there that's kind of neat where you can customize parameters from that.
So Corey,
so then, yes.
Can you go back real quick to the conditions there? So this is one of the areas where, some of the things that when you think about licensing that Corey was talking about previously, there are some basic MFA things that you can turn on that don't require additional licensing, but none of these things are available in them. You can't do anything called conditional access. So all these things Corey's talking about do require that extra license that is included in the business premium SKU, or you have to get like the Azure Active Directory license, as Corey alluded to. So there's that. That's one of the things I like to illustrate, because that's one of the differences between when I've heard people ask, well, I thought you could get MFA for free. You can, but you can't do any of this. And that's one of the reasons why we typically don't recommend using the free version, that's free capabilities. The other thing that we have found that is very much applicable to most of the clients that we work with is location-based stuff, or the IP-based condition, meaning that, for instance, we work with medical facilities, or if people don't want to have to keep bringing up their phone all the time. If you're accessing from within your office, then that IP address, the fact that you're connecting from your office and from that IP address can be the second factor, so that you actually can minimize the amount of times people are, having to go to their authenticator app on their phone, or clicking approve, or entering that extra code. And so when Corey says that location-based condition, it's a very common one that's used relative to making it simpler for your staff to have to, use, again, hit the multi-factor authentication button or code. So again, I just wanted to illustrate that's a common way we've seen that employed, and it's a common concern that we've heard from folks about, well, gosh, I don't want my staff having to do all that extra stuff and carry their cell phones around, like if you're in a medical facility or something like that. So these are some things you can employ to mitigate that concern. So how we've seen that applied with clients.
Yep, and great point to bring up. So Microsoft does have what they call per user MFA, and that's where Nate was talking about, kind of the older system that doesn't have all the granular controls. I know Microsoft has put out there that they are planning to actually remove that feature set from the Microsoft platform. Timeline unknown. Knowing Microsoft, it could be a year, it could be 5, but they're looking at removing that. And on top of that, so that will conflict with any conditional access rules that are applied. So if per user MFA is turned on for a user, it null and voids any conditional access rules. And there are some things you can do with it, but it's super limited. And it doesn't seem to be a very solid solution for users, I guess is the way to put it, right? So every time we've had that implemented, users are getting prompted way more often. Every time they, log in from one location, then they go to another location, connect to Wi-Fi, they're having to MFA again. Like there's all sorts of pieces that are not as productive for a user compared to conditional access. It's also has to be managed on the per user basis, where conditional access is you can set all users, and any user in your 365 tenant all of a sudden has that access rule applied to them. And so this is where Microsoft is pushing everybody to go, is to these conditional access based rules, because of one management, but two, just the control you can have towards the security aspect of accessing the environment. Right, so let's look at access controls. So these are all the access control options you kind of have. So you have block and grant based on multi-factor authentication. That's basically yes prompt for it. Is it a compliant device? Is it Azure Hybrid 80 joined or not? Does it have approved client apps? So we use conditional access rules with a lot of our clients to enforce that users can only use the Outlook app on their cell phone to be able to access their email. And so this is where that Microsoft Authenticator app comes in big, is that it helps bridge that gap to say, yes, they have the Microsoft Authenticator app. Yes, that is connected and sees Outlook app on the phone. Yes, let them connect. Otherwise, it won't let them connect. And so we're starting to see a lot of companies want that aspect too, for app protection, data protection on personal devices. And it really doesn't require installing a lot of heavy duty MDM features onto a phone, because you can control it all with app protection policies in the background, which is where the other one is app protection policies. And I think a nice one here too is requiring password changes. So, if there is that risky sign-in, you can actually specify, hey, a risky sign-in, make the user change the password next time they log in. Right, and so, or force the user to change their password now, or force the user to do this. So there's some elements that you can do with some of those rules for that blocking and granting access. And then obviously session. So the big ones with sessions here, these are all the different ones, but it's sign-in frequency. And this comes into helping make it more, I guess, seamless or less disruptive for everybody trying to work, right? So sign-in frequency, we usually set to 30 days. And so what that's going to do is on your phone or tablet or whatever it happens to be that you've accessed your email from, or the 365 apps from, it's going to say, oh, well, you just authenticated, 2 days ago. I still got 28 days till I have to force you to MFA again. And so it gives you that time frame where you don't have to MFA. And then when it comes back up, a lot of times it's just a, oh, we're signing you in. sends that prompt to the phone. You can say approve, and there you go. You're right back in. And then persistent browser session, we typically will set that to enabled. That just allows that but when you're using the web browser, specifically Edge, to be able to stay connected, using that same credentials without having to log in every single time. So there are some other rules on the sessions that we're not going to go into the details, so we can kind of keep moving along and jump right into the demo here. But the big one here too that we're talking about is augmenting passwords. So hardware tokens I mentioned earlier. I'm not sure if you guys can see that, but this is, I'm holding it up here in front of the camera kind of too. That's a YubiKey. It's just a little USB device that allows you to put your credentials on a device instead of having to remember them. So I'll show a little snippet here of using a YubiKey to actually log into 365. It's really cool. And then obviously biometrics with Windows Hello that we mentioned earlier. And so now comes time for all the. Oh, go ahead.
Corey, before you do that, like what we've seen, so the using a YubiKey or something like that, or some sort of a token or a key fob, is usually if you have someone in your organization that doesn't want, or if you don't want personal devices, because lots of times people's mobile devices for the Microsoft Authenticator app, now you're asking them to put a device on their app, and maybe they don't want that, or maybe they're refusing to do that, or you have someone that doesn't have a smartphone, which is rare, but it happens. This is one of those capabilities that exists, and you can. So instead of this is another option in those scenarios, which again we don't find as often, but those are a couple of scenarios that we found where people might choose to use that as an illustration.
Yeah, and the most common place that I've seen that come into play is more of the factory type environments where the warehouse workers don't want to put stuff on their phones, or they don't have, they're still using the old flip phone, right? Or some of those positions, right? That usually it's not the, the office staff, the admins that have those issues. It's usually those that, I don't want to say like poorly, but those who are doing those like entry level kind of, labor jobs, right? So those are what they're usually seeing. But let's hop into the tenant here and take a look and kind of play around a little bit. So there's a couple ways to get to where all of this is at. So hopefully you can see my cursor. I tried to blow it up and make it red so we can kind of talk through the clicks and you can see where I'm clicking here. But we have just the basic admin.microsoft.com login page. So this is where you can come. You would go show all, go down to Azure Active Directory, which I already have a tab opened here for. An Azure Active Directory is where we're going to kind of start to look at setup. So Azure Active Directory specifically, and we will scroll down and find security and click on security. Under security, this is where we're going to start to be able to see, okay, conditional access rules, some identity protection, named locations, authentication methods, and MFA, risky users and risky sign-ins as well. And so when we look at this, named locations, this is where we add in our specific sites, right? And so you can create a site, you put in a name, you put in IP addresses, you can put in multiple IP address ranges. I just put a couple dummy addresses in here, except for this one that's got my name on it, because we're going to use that as part of one of our little demos here to show how that impacts a user signing in that's behind that location. Authentication methods, we'll click on that next here. And this is where I can start to say, hey, I want to use a FIDO2 security key as an option, the Microsoft Authenticator app. And the FIDO2 key, that's the YubiKey, that's the hardware token that we're talking about. So you can enable those as options. It's just as simple as these are all listed. You come in here and you just say enable and allow users to use that option. And then we will step back here to security. You have MFA here. So when you click on this, this is where you can start talking about the fraudulent alerts. And so I'm going to click on fraud alerts here. And this is where you can say, yes, allow users to send a fraud alert. So this is where you get that push notification. That push notification then would, they like, oh, this wasn't me, I hit no. That's what's going to get reported here. Right. And then from here, I can say, hey, do I want to block that user who does a fraud report? Yes or no. I could say, yes, block that user. or I could say, no, don't block that user. Right? If I say yes to block that user, then what's going to happen? I'm going to discard any changes here. They're going to show up in this blocked user list here, right? So then all of a sudden, oh, I've got this blocked user list. I can come in here, I can select users, and I can unblock them, right? So I could, let's see here. It'll give me a option here. It's not. Okay. You can come in. You can also specify specific users to block as well, but this would prevent them from being able to sign in. This will also allow you to, here under account lockout, set number of MFA denials before an account will be locked, how many minutes until an account will be unlocked, after that initial lockout happens, or and unblocked, right? So we can say, hey, if they have 5 failed attempts, automatically block the account, give them 60 minutes till it unblocks the account and resets the counter. Then you can set up notifications. So notification be like, hey, send notifications to, admin team, or, for us, we have like a general help desk login or email address. It can send an alert to that. So we can say, hey, somebody reported fraud. We can go in and start, looking at that issue and trying to help that user recover back and getting back into their account, unblock their account, help them reset passwords, things like that. Do some investigation on it.
Hey, Corey,
those are the, yep.
While you're digging in, I think this is applicable, so I'm going to, forgive me for interjecting. So relative to these different security settings, you had mentioned that the P2 license versus the P1 license is needed. So I think the ones you're covering today are covered in the P1 license, but there's additional ones that we haven't yet covered that are part of the P2. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So the only big one that comes for the P2 is the risky sign-ins. It's one of the 2 risky sign-ins, right? One is included with P1, one is included with P2. And so that will be more under the conditional rule itself, and not under here. And so, yeah. So yeah,
so all the stuff we've covered so far, other than that one thing, which is a little later, is included in the P1 license, which is part of the business premium SKU.
Yes, this is all part of that initial P1 SKU. Yep. All right. So I'm going to click back up here on security and bring us back to that main page. And so here, this is where I'm saying, so you have risky users and risky sign-ins. So risky users is what's included with the P1, risky sign-ins is what's included with the P2, right? So you can actually click here and this will give you a report of, your users, what their risk level is. And so the different risk levels, we can look at applying rules to based on that. So you can come in here and see what the risk is of users. And we don't have any risky sign-ins, but if there were, it would show up as risky sign-ins in here. No, not there. There's one other screen I wanted to show. It's under authentication methods. Yep. So if you were under authentication methods, there's user registration details. And so I'm going to click on this because this is going to help kind of get a evaluation with our demo. So we have 2 users, Alex W and Alan D, that I'm going to be using in the demo here. I've already set up MFA for Alex W. And so you can come in here and you can actually see, hey, who's enrolled in MFA? What methods do they have enrolled for MFA? And be able to know, like, where is your team at? Now, this is huge when you're trying to deploy MFA because, you can send out instructions, hey, everybody do this. Most people are going to get it done. There's going to be a handful who don't. From the administrative perspective, you can come in and look and see who needs to be enabled, help go get those users enabled, and then move forward. We utilize this very heavily when we do MFA deployments because we don't want to be that guy, if you will, who turns on MFA and then nobody can log in because nobody knows how to set up MFA, right? So this just helps set that up ahead of time. And we always recommend pre-enrollment before actually enabling MFA. So users can go, register a mobile app on their phone at any given time. It'll show up in here. And then once you enable the rule, then it'll start to use their authentication method that they have supplied. And so this is where you can see that. So I'm going to go back up to security using the little trail at the top, and I'm going to click on conditional access. And this is where all the fun pieces start to come together. So under here, you do have named locations where you can do the IPs here as well. But policies is where we're at. this policy that I have here that says MFA, we're going to open this one up and just take a look at it and kind of work through it. So the first part of a policy, obviously you put a name and you're going to specify users, right? And so here you can change different types, like it says workload identities and preview, but users and groups is usually where we stick. And one of the things I like to call out here, so you can specify users and groups, but as I would often refer to, this is managing the inclusion into a rule. Typically with a blanket default MFA rule, you're going to want to do all users. And then if you have a subset of accounts, like we mentioned earlier, like a scanning account, you'll want to put those under exclude. But here I just as an example where I did a user, a group, I did a user, and I specified a user. And we could go directory roles, and then we can start to add application developers is in that as well. So if there's somebody with the application developer rule, that would apply to them. Here you even have to include all guest and external users, right? And this is where we were talking about adding in that. Now, if you click all users, it's going to include all of those people. You don't have to do this individually, which is why the blanket rule, we recommend all users. Exclusions. So this is where you can come in and create exclusions. Now, what we typically will do is we will create an excluded group, and then we can just add those users to that group, right? So it'd be, these people or these accounts don't need MFA because of it's a scanning account. That's going to be kind of huge because we can utilize that with other rules to set limitations or to set parameters. So here we have that group in there. Our next thing to look at is cloud apps, right? So here's where we're saying, okay, you can do all cloud apps or you can do selected apps. And this is where the app has to be registered. So if we hit selected apps, we get this blade over here on the side and it shows Office 365, Azure Advanced Threat Protection. As you scroll down, you'll start to notice Forms, Intune, Planner, Stream. And this is where if the app is not registered, it won't show up. Also note, it only shows you partial results. So typically, if you're looking to create a rule around a specific app, you might have to search for it. So we can see if it's going to show up for us here. There we go. So we get some different Azure ones that we can look at, like Microsoft Azure Management, and some things here. So you could just click that and only add that one app to the rule. I'll switch this back to all cloud apps. For blanket MFA, we usually recommend just doing all cloud apps. Conditions, this is where you can come in again. So user risk, this needs the P1 license. Sign-in risk needs the P2 license. And if you hover over it, it tells you that here. Requires the Azure AD Premium 2 license for that. So user risk, that's where we were talking about. We showed the user risk earlier. I can say configure if they're a high level risk. I can say, yep, do that. That's where you can come in and do the specific rules of let's do a high level risk for users. And if it's high level, force a password change, right? That's what that rule would look like. Sign-in risk, same kind of idea. What is their risk on that particular sign-in? Is it a no risk, low, medium, or high? You can specify there. Device platforms, as we mentioned earlier, so you can say, hey, configure only if they're logging in from an iOS or Android device. Does this rule apply? Even Windows Phone, so if they're doing the, mobile right there, if they're on mobile, this rule applies. We are not going to save that. Location. So here, where do you want this rule to apply? Everywhere in the world or just in specific locations? So obviously everywhere. And here's where you can do exclusions. So in this particular rule, I don't have the query location. And that's going to be important as we look at this other rule here in a minute. But here, cloud apps or client apps, as I was saying, modern on legacy. So you can say configure, and they can't use legacy authentication apps if you uncheck that. And the filter, this is where you can do the special rules. I think this is kind of neat where you can say, I want a specific property. So here's the property that you might be looking for. You could say, is the manufacturer equal to, and you could say Dell, right? And now all of a sudden that has to be a Dell laptop for them to use, right? And so some of these features, I'm just pointing them out. Not necessarily are they needed, but just to note that. Conditional access or the grant access roles here. So block access or provide access. And this is where you can say require MFA, device has to be compliant, Azure AD joined, all that. You can say require one or all selected controls, right? So as we're saying, if we're doing a, rule, if they're a high risk, you could say require password change, and then it requires them to change their password, right? We're not going to use that rule. We're just going to say this one is just requiring a multi-factor approval. And again, the session controls we would typically set for 30 days and allow persistent browser sessions. So that way they can go between the different 365 apps without having to MFA every time they log in. All right, so that's that conditional access rule. I just backed out of it there. The second one is the same exact rule. The only condition difference is that under location, I'm just going to show here, I added in the query address, okay? And it's to a different user. So that first policy is under Alex. The second policy is going to do Alan. And so what I'm going to do is pull up a machine here, and we are going to go here, and we are going to go to portal.office.com and do kind of a login so we can kind of show the difference here. So here we're going to sign in with the Alex account. Here I'm going to have to put in the password. All right. Again. And I'm going to get an MFA prompt, right? Now this is important to note because earlier we said, right, we had Alex was the only one who was set up with MFA. And I'm going to approve that MFA here from my device. And we should have access here in just a moment, right? So that's the experience a user would see if they weren't in the office, get prompted every 30 days. Now I'm going to open a guest browser session here. And remember, so I'm going to log in with Alan on this one. Now, Alan doesn't have MFA set up, right? So if we go back and we look at, I'm going to back out here, back to security, authentication methods, and user registration. Alan doesn't have anything set up for MFA. He has licensing for MFA, for the conditional access rules. He doesn't have MFA set up, but he does have the conditional access rule here applied to him that requires MFA if he's not at one of those locations, right? And so pointing that out here, let me pull back up the machine. So if we come here to log in, Alan's login, just to copy paste here, I don't have to. We're going to notice, one, I didn't get prompted to set up MFA, and two, it's not prompting me for MFA because it's behind, it's in one of those excluded IP address locations, right? So this is where it's really nice to use those. This would be the user experience for somebody at the office. For users that don't want to have an app on their phone, right? They don't want to do the Microsoft Authenticator app and they only access data from the office. This is a viable option to keep them still secure if they're outside the office, but still be able to get in without having to set everything up. Now, we still recommend that they would enroll for DMFA services, as we're going to talk about. I think it's even on next week. I might have forgot to mention it earlier, or not next week, the next session is self-service password reset. Uses the same setup for authentications to allow users to reset their passwords, which we'll talk about during the next session. But this is the experience of a user when they log in that's got one of those IP addresses whitelisted, right? And so again, we didn't have to set up MFA, but we still had the rule applied. And so we can come back into our conditional access and we can do some audit logs. And then we can look at where we were at. Alan, we were able to, let's see here, where's our logs at? Now, it takes time for the logs to show up, but earlier here you can see where I had logged in with Alan and I didn't have any prompts for it. So let's see here, sign in logs might get, let's see if it gives us anything extra here. Okay. Yep, so here you can see earlier, right? This is where we actually just signed in with Alex, required MFA, might give us a log here in just a little bit, but here earlier you can see single factor success because we're behind a protected IP or a whitelisted IP. So let's see if it gives us that. And it takes a minute for that to show up, but that's just to show what that looks like from there. So if you're also trying to troubleshoot conditional access sign-in, you can come under monitoring, sign-in logs, and see where those accesses are coming from and different elements there that are, successes or not applied or even login failures, right? And then you can click on it and get more granular detail. It'll even show you locations, devices, authentication details, any conditional access rules that are applied, and it'll show you reports. So that is there. And then, yeah, so policies here. So those are the policies. Yeah, so that's kind of the demo here. I'm showing some of that. I was going to show as well. Let's see here if this will. So this would be like using Windows Hello, right? I didn't do anything. I have a laptop that's set here with Face ID. That's Windows Hello login, which is kind of a nice feature to be able to log in. So you can kind of see that in action. That was literally just turning my laptop screen up so I could look at it, and it logged me right on in. And then the other one I wanted to demonstrate.
Corey, relative to that Windows Hello,
Yep.
like, because that's one of the ones that we're starting to hear more people asking about. There's important variables and criteria that are there that make Windows Hello not as easy as people might seem. So can you touch on
Yes.
that just to make sure that we're not misleading folks, or they have some bumpers or criteria that to understand that piece a little bit more?
Yes, definitely. Okay. Yep. So Windows Hello uses biometrics. So that's going to be Face ID, fingerprint. Windows Hello can even classify it being using a hardware token as well. And so to make those things work, there has to be some special pieces of hardware for that. Fingerprint obviously needs fingerprint scanner. The Face ID needs a specialized camera that can do like an infrared kind of 3D imaging type idea, right? So part of the reason phones have gotten more and more expensive over the last, 5 to 10 years is because they're adding those pieces of hardware into the phones that can do some of that type of identification, right? Otherwise, if you don't have those specialized cameras, I could just take a picture off the wall, hold it up to the camera, and it would Face ID, right? And so there's specialized cameras for that. That can drive the cost of a laptop up 100, $200, something along those lines. So it's not necessarily a cheap option. The laptop that I have has it. It was not a cheap laptop, but it's a nice feature there as well. So, and then the fingerprint scanners, those aren't as expensive, and a lot of times you can get those some hardware tokens, some FIDO2 keys that actually have fingerprint scanners built into them. So you can even tie that in for your Windows Hello. You can get USB attachable ones. I've seen them as low as like $30, $40 on Amazon, but you can get those fingerprint scanners that allow you to do that type of scanning. Disadvantage with that is if your USB for some reason stops working, you can't get into Windows with it. You have to use a password, but there's always that failback for password. If I go back to
And as you're finding that, Corey, like that's the biggest thing that most webcams on the laptops that if any of us have laptops, most of the webcams that are built into those, unless you've specifically tried to find one that has those capabilities, most likely you are not going to be able to use the Face ID of Windows Hello component with your standard webcam. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to bring that up, because you presume because most phones can do that really easily, that most laptops can, and that's not true. So just be aware of that if that's something you're thinking about for your team.
Exactly. And then for the sign in, so let's say like I say, your fingerprint scanner stops working, right? On your login screen, you have the option to hit sign in options and do things like enter password, enter PIN number, Face ID. The other options, that are within Windows Hello allow you to do like an image on the screen where you have to click a couple certain spots to be able to get that authentication in. But that is, not something that we typically are recommending at this time. Our recommendation is if you're trying to do a sign in that you actually use a hardware token, like a USB YubiKey type hardware token. And then I was going to demonstrate here, I guess, user logging in to an account with a YubiKey. Let me pull up the account here real quick. So this one I have set up with a YubiKey, right? So here I put in the thing. It says, "Hey, trying to sign you in with your YubiKey," right? So it's going to tell me to follow instructions. Here I have a PIN number set to my key. I type in the PIN number. It's going to tell me to touch the little keypad, and there it's now signed me in, right? So that's the experience with using a YubiKey. Now, don't necessarily have to have a key that requires a PIN number and all those other steps. The one that I use does, just because I want to make sure it's actually me using it. But that's just to show the element, right? And now all of a sudden I'm logged in to that account. So that's just to kind of show the different access methods there as well. And so I would say that it kind of rolls through the demo here. Do we have any questions that came up to cover?
Yeah, so let's open that up. I know that there's a couple that came in on chat that we commented on or replied to or interjected already. But like definitely open up for those folks who might have any questions that you'd like to ask relative to setting up MFA, deploying MFA, conditional access. You know, one of the challenges that exists, and I'm buying some time for you to ask some questions here. One of the challenges is knowing all of the different capabilities and options that are available so that you can turn them on applicably and appropriately for your organization or not. So in lieu of let me ask you a question, Corey, that's coming from me, because you touched on it a little bit, but I think that there's the mobile application management and mobile device management. While those are not part of MFA per se, they kind of are related to and they work together. But you touched on it earlier. So I think I saw in your admin screen there where the mobile application management components exist. Definitely keep if there's questions, pop them in there. But this is one thing that I think we're also seeing a trend recently in the last a couple of years, but people more and more paying attention to the difference between mobile device versus mobile application management that I think is applicable to how it applies to MFA in particular.
Yeah, and so with MFA, that's where you can do some of that application management, right? Require app protection policies, and so app protection policies allow you to enforce things like data is encrypted, data is only accessed from, say, Microsoft's products, right? Word, Excel, even on the mobile, right? The nice thing with mobile application management is, other than just having the Authenticator app and the Microsoft apps on your phone to access that, you don't need, some sort of robust other application on the phone that's going to take full control over it. And it allows users to use their own device for that. And so the way I like to think of it is, mobile device management is for company-owned devices. Mobile application management is for personally owned devices. And so that's how I kind of like to think of it there. And it was under the grant controls, right, where we had the require protection policies or approved apps. And so even if you click on like show a list of approved apps, right, if we turn it on, this takes us to or we click at it, takes us to the Microsoft website, and it shows these are all the approved apps that if we click that box, this is what it's going to let us access the data from. And so that's where some of that application management, as we're talking about, comes in for non-company owned devices. So, and there's a question I just saw in chat too. Was just a little bit ago. I'll touch base on too, because it kind of plays an effect, right? Is do you know if you need Azure AD P2 licensing for all users or just to manage the policies? So with the P1 or the P2 license is per user. So to have all of the users have MFA enabled, all the users have to have the P1 license. To have that risky sign-in evaluation, all users have to have a P2 license. And so I think it's an important distinction to note that, yes, I might be able to get a license, one license, and I can create the policies and all that. It's not going to take effect on a user who doesn't have the license. So that's a big call out there too. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, and the one thing that I've also seen that's a little bit of an unknown, and like Corey, I think this is still true, so help me if I'm stepping on my toes here. But one of the things, if you're not turning on as an organization, if by policy you're not turning on the use Microsoft apps to access our corporate data, one of the things that I think you're by default also allowing, if you're connecting to email from, like, say, the native iOS or the native Android mail app, is that you're giving permission to the organization to possibly wipe your whole phone. Is that still true? I think that is.
Yes, it's still a risk, right? So the part of the reason you want to use the native Office apps and you want the authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator on the phone, is that way it helps control all that. So if for some reason somebody's not, and I say, hey, this is protected data, I want to issue a wipe against this user, there is the risk that it will factory reset that user's personal phone, right? May or may not. Microsoft calls it out as a risk. But if they don't have those apps and they don't have the Authenticator app, it doesn't know what to do. And so it's like, well, I guess I'll just reset that device. I have seen this happen at one of the organizations that we work with where they did that here actually just last month. And the user was using the native mail app on his phone. They sent device wipe or data wipe, right? Because it's not managed device, it's managing the data. They sent managed data, and it factory reset the user's personal phone. Obviously, they weren't very happy about that because they lost all their pictures and everything else that was there. So that is a big caution with not using the apps, which when we typically set these policies up, that's why we typically set up, require, the Microsoft approved apps for accessing data, just to help add that layer of safety, I guess you would say, around those personal devices. So.
Yeah, and that's a way for, as an organization, again, it's a simple question to ask yourself is, just to check and turn on that policy so that it requires your team, so they won't be able to use the native mail apps on phones to access email, your corporate email. They have to use them, and all the apps are free. So the mobile apps are free. That's not a big deal. But then it allows you that if that person leaves the organization or the device is lost or stolen, you can initiate that wipe, and it only pulls the data from those Microsoft applications that are your corporate data, not any of the personal stuff like their personal family pictures or all that kind of stuff. So again, a little bit of a thing that is very not always known, and a strong reason it's a good practice to do, just to make sure that you're managing that data and securing that data with your company policy, but it also then protects the end user from an accidental complete factory reset of their phone if something were to go sideways. So, any other comments or questions from this? I know this is part one. There's a lot here. That's why we broke it up into two parts. Maybe give you a moment for another question if there is any. But again, next session we want to take this foundation, which is why we call it part one and part two, of saying MFA, core MFA, and conditional access rules. And now how do you apply that to other capabilities like, single sign-on, enabling third-party applications, like some of the idiosyncrasies and problems you might run into of integrating third-party applications into that. Self-service password resets, which is another variable that plays into this whole equation. So it's taking the foundation, and we're going to be building on that in the next session. And again, these are all recorded, and so they'll be available for you for future reference. So with that said, I'm not seeing other comments. Brian, thank you for the shout out. Hopefully it was valuable to you as you think about employing MFA or not. If you've already employed MFA, maybe there's some nuggets here that you've learned that you might want to adjust the configuration settings of how you want to employ and build certain policies relative to your MFA to improve the experience for your end users. So this is one of those rare things, by the way, that if we turn on MFA and single sign-on, we can actually create an easier experience for the end users, as opposed to adding security and creating more inconvenience. So Pat, again, thanks for the shout out. Good job, Corey. So with that said, Corey, any final thoughts before we sign off?
The only thing I would say is MFA everything, even in your personal life. So, yep, MFA, MFA, MFA.
Absolutely. I can't stress that enough. So thanks a lot, everybody. Make it a great day, and we'll see you next time.